Welcome back. Welcome back. Hillary Clinton, despite all the evidence, still refuses to quit the Democratic battle. But why? Could she still possibly win? Or is she just in it to destroy Barack Obama's chances? This week, of course, she was involved in that huge row when she said that anything can happen in June, and remembered the 1968 assassination of the then Democratic frontrunner, Robert Kennedy, a remark for which she later apologized. So why is Mrs. Clinton still running? I was joined earlier by one of her closest advisors, who knows the answer to that question for sure, Sidney Blumenthal. Sidney, if you were to leave this studio now and Hilary was on the phone and said, do you think the time has come to withdraw from this race? What would your reply be?
My advice would be and is no. I believe she still has a chance to win, and I think it's incumbent upon her to continue this race. Certainly before the primaries are concluded, we need to let all the voters be heard. We need to resolve the issues of Michigan and Florida, not only before the Rules Committee, but if there's not full representation, I think that matter ought to be brought before the convention. And because I think that the voting population of 10% of the Democratic Party nationally in 2 of the critical states that we need to win need to be resolved favorably within the party in a way that helps us in the November election.
What would you do? Would you suggest, just on that, you have a proper race in both of those states then?
Well, I think there ought to have been revotes in those states. I think that in some cases, in the case of Michigan, the Obama forces blocked a revote. In the case of Florida, the state legislatures controlled by the Republicans, they were open to a revote, but it was just impossible mechanically for it to happen. But the party ought to have done more to make possible positive alternative remedies, and we should not be where we are now. This is a kind of quagmire and disaster, and potentially very damaging for the party in the long run.
But I mean, it's not only Florida and Michigan. I mean, the actual party itself determined that these 2 states should not count, didn't they?
It should not have rested there at the end. It should have, the Democratic National Committee should have actively sought alternative remedies, particularly given the 4th and 8th largest state that Democrats need to win. They can't afford to alienate those voters and to exclude them from the convention. Had this been dealt with quickly and expeditiously, then the dynamic of this race might well have been different as well.
But assuming for a moment your scenario, as it were, that Hillary doesn't withdraw and should not withdraw, what is the scenario by which she could win the nomination?
Well, I think that there are arguments that need to be made to the superdelegates. They're going to determine who the nominee is. There are those who are pledged delegates who come out of the caucuses and primary, and then there are superdelegates or automatic delegates. Those are the party leaders, the members of Congress, the governors, and so on. These people are going to determine whether it's Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton. No one's going to win without the superdelegates. And for them, there are a number of arguments. Barack Obama says the key metric is who's won on the pledged delegates. But we have to see what happens at the end of the primaries and whether Hillary has won the popular vote, because that matters a lot in terms of legitimacy in a party that calls itself Democratic.
Without Florida and Michigan, she couldn't win the popular vote, could she?
Well, I think that those need to be factored in, especially Florida needs to be factored in. And we need to get to the end and see what happens in these remaining states over the next week. It's only another week. And wait till next week, see what happens, let's see what the vote is. And then there are another set of arguments, and that has to do with electability. Who can actually put together the coalition of the states that you need to win the Electoral College?
Would it be possible that Hillary Clinton could serve on the same ticket with an Obama presidency, or the other way around with Obama? Or is it in fact that has the bitterness or whatever has gone on made that a nightmare scenario?
Well, I hope that there's not a lot of bitterness, including among the various supporters, that would prevent party unity so the Democrats could triumph in the fall. I know that about a couple months ago, Hillary floated the idea of Obama being a vice president. I don't know what will happen in terms of vice presidents. And obviously, my association with Hillary makes me say that Hillary should be the presidential nominee. But Hillary has said she'll support the nominee of the party if it's not her, enthusiastically, and that Senator Obama, no doubt, will do the same.
And if Hillary, Sidney, wasn't the candidate and, say, Senator Obama was, would you still vote Democrat?
Well, of course. I'm a lifelong Democrat, and I know, as I've said, that Senator Clinton would work very hard for the ticket. And I would assume that Senator Obama would too if Senator Clinton were the nominee.
And do you consider that you've got your new book, Sidney Blumenthal, The Strange Death of Republican America, Chronicles of a Collapsing Party here. That raises the question of the Republican threat to the Democrats, etc. Do you think that John McCain is a tough candidate to beat or not?
I think he is a formidable candidate. I think he is the only potential candidate the Republicans could have nominated who stands a chance, given the discrediting of the Republican Party, which I describe in my book. I think that McCain was emerged not through any deliberate strategy on the part of the party establishment, but because he wended his way through the ruins of the Republican Party, a shattered party with different primary candidates representing different factions. And McCain suddenly came forward. He is a maverick. He stands apart from the party. He's got to consolidate his base within the party at the same time. But he's the only one, I think, who can defy the gravity of the Republican Party brand that pulls down Republicans in this year.
So that he is more formidable than, you use the word formidable, than any other Republican would have been.
I certainly believe that, and I would never discount the potential appeal of John McCain, who is a war hero, who has stood apart from his party on any number of issues, and whose authenticity has to be granted.
We'll leave it there, Sidney. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, David.
It is one of the most controversial topics around. Is torture ever justified? Viewers with long memories, well, not particularly long, medium memories, may recall our interview with top US lawyer Alan Dershowitz back in March, when he insisted that under certain, very limited, regulated circumstances, torture might be acceptable.
Torture has worked on several occasions to prevent ticking bombs from going off. A famous case in the Philippines, where a person was tortured and revealed a plot to kill the Pope and to blow up airplanes across the Pacific Ocean. We know that a kidnapping was foiled in the state of Florida by the use of torture. There are other situations, perhaps not many. That's why I'm against use of torture, and why, if it's used, it should be limited only to the ticking bomb situation where the evidence is completely compelling.
However, a new book, Torture and Democracy, puts the counter-argument. And earlier I spoke to its author, Darius Rejali, and asked him if there's a link between torture and dictatorship.
Well, dictatorships deserve their reputation for cruelty and torture, absolutely, and their record simply doesn't compare to that of democracies. Nevertheless, democracies have tortured, and many of the classic ones, Greek, Roman, Venetian, Florentine, all had legalized torture. Torture has occurred in democracies. It's not that they have no history of torture, they have a different one.
A different one?
That's right. There are a number of features to them. One is that democracies typically over time, particularly in the last century, have favored techniques that are highly coercive, extremely painful, but leave few marks. And so the distribution of clean techniques, as I like to call them, has grown over time. Electric torture, for example. Electric
torture is an example of something that doesn't leave any traces.
If it's used properly, right? I mean, there are cases where you can use it in very bad ways and scar people, but the the French pioneered the use of electrotorture that became famous in the use of the field telephone magneto in Vietnam in 1931. And Americans were using electrotorture for policing as early as the 1910s, using all sorts of devices in New York and Dallas and so forth to force confessions from ordinary criminals.
And do we think that torture works? I mean, the people, those of us who are against the idea of torture, are horrified by the whole idea. We try and all say that no, the point is all it produces is false confessions from people who are just eager to end the pain, and so they'll admit to anything, and therefore torture doesn't really achieve anything. But I suppose the fact that it goes on and on and on means it must achieve something for somebody.
Well, absolutely, but false confessions are extremely valuable. One should never underestimate the role of a false confession before a court or a camera. Stalin taught us all about the importance of false confessions without Marx. One can stipulate quite clearly that torture works to produce false confessions. It also can intimidate people. Who could dispute that? The question is whether it can produce timely, accurate information under limited circumstances and be used by organizations. And there the data is pretty clear. Even the Gestapo and the Japanese Kempeitai knew it was the worst method of intelligence gathering possible. So it's a well-known feature of most public policing that the thing that works best is public cooperation. And when public cooperation isn't available, the chances that a crime will be identified or cleared falls to less than 10%.
So why is there so much of it? Is it partially that it brings pleasure, sexual pleasure, to the torturers?
Certainly.
Is it that partly?
Certainly there are some torturers who have expressed the fact that there is nothing quite like having absolute power over another human being. There's leaving the sexual dimension out of it. One of the things that democracies are all about is never to give absolute power over another human being, because that power corrupts absolutely. Slavery teaches that. Torture teaches us that.
How many countries in the world today? There's 180 at the UN. There's more than 50 or 60 watching this program on Al Jazeera. What's the number of countries that actually are using torture at the moment in one way or another?
Well, it's a number that varies, but I would say, let's just say with electrotorture, just to be quite specific, because each technique differs, I would say close to 100 countries now use electrotorture, and the spur towards electrotorture happened roughly starting in the 60s. Only 5 or 6 countries used electrotorture in the 50s. And then the number doubled or tripled every decade since. And it should be clear that electrotorture is very useful for intimidating people in prisons, for getting false confessions, and the vast majority of torture that we document is for these purposes. It's not really for gathering information. Even if you go to like the professional Israeli interrogators, they'll tell you that their key information comes from informants, the asafir, and that torture really doesn't account for a significant chunk of their intelligence.
So in conclusion, we have to conclude that, from what you're saying, that torture is here to stay.
I suspect that in the near future, given the fact that we're constantly in search for intelligence and when governments are really unable to learn, the likelihood that torture will be privatized, because of increasing monitoring of human rights agencies, it will be privatized and pushed into the dark. The techniques will become increasingly cleaner. It doesn't mean that torture will disappear. We basically need increased political literacy to recognize that even when someone has no clean marks, there are forensic ways to determine when torture has happened. And it's actually incredibly easy to stop torture. All you really need is clear leadership, clear rules, punishment for violation rules, and regular remand before medical and judicial authorities.
Thank you very much indeed. That list is a encouraging list in one sense, all it needs, but there's a long way to go. Thank you very much.
Great
indeed.
Pleasure being here. Thank you so much.
In a minute, I'll be joined by the man with the golden pen, the author of the new James Bond novel, Sebastian Faulks. That's after the news, which is next.